Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Today, we'll be doing a sort of compare and contrast between China and India and their models of development. We touch on the nature of their liberation struggles, the questions of women's liberation and patriarchy in the two countries, the agrarian question, neoliberalism, and these two countries' broader place in the global south. In addition to whichever platform you're listening to this or watching this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. Okay, welcome Jyotishman to the International Solidarity Pod. Perhaps you can start by introducing yourself to the audience.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. And hi, I'm Jyotishman, and I run the YouTube podcast India and Global Left. My interest has been broadly thinking about economy, a bit of history, the left movement, also media. Yeah, that's what I do. And yeah, once again, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. So today, we'll be doing a bit of a compare and contrast between China and India and their models of development. These are both, the only countries in the world to have populations upward of 1 billion. These are also sort of ancient civilizations, as it's spoken of course, in the case of India. This, applies to the subcontinent more broadly rather than just the Republic of India. India and China, also both achieved liberation or independence at a similar time. India in 1947 and China in 1949. But despite these, there are also huge, massive gaps in development and living standards between the two countries. So this is what we're hoping to explore in this episode. I'll ask you first, Jyotishman, perhaps to give us a broad overview of how you compare the two countries. Then we can dive deeper afterward. I was also watching your interview with journalist Chris Hedges, and you provided a very interesting anecdote from when you were in China that might help encompass some of these differences. So, if you will, perhaps if you're okay with it, maybe I'll ask you to start with that anecdote. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that was when I was at Tsinghua learning I think at that time it was my intermediate Chinese. And there are professional cleaning staff who comes to your room and cleans your room. And I had left my mobile charging point at the mobile charger at the charging point. And I was off to class, and they had their digital key, and they could open the door, and they cleaned the room, and they left a notice in Chinese. And it said that by leaving your charger at the charging station, you put the entire building in an electrical hazard, and so don't do this. And I was struck by three things about that. And of course, I knew her. She was about middle 40s, early, middle 40s, not early 50s, but middle 40s. And the fact that she could write definitely struck me, because I've never come across someone in mid 40s in India who cleans your toilet and room could actually read or write. I personally never met anyone. I mean, I don't think there would be even a single exception to that rule. So that was the first thing, which talks about the first point of divergence in post-independent India and China, and there is a lot to actually discuss even before the national liberation. But if we could just start with national liberation, it was where the Maoist project had massively redistributed education and basic healthcare to its population. And so universal literacy was achieved very early in communist China, but not in India. Even today, we are somewhere around 70% maybe. Women's literacy is even less, somewhere in the late 60s, and men's literacy would be late 70s, but China is effectively 100% literacy rate. So that was the first point. The second point, of course, was they care for electrical hazard. Like I spent a lot of years in Delhi. You can burn the building and it could die. Even your neighbors wouldn't give a shit about it, if I can use that language. And the fact that someone cares about electrical hazard, the fact that someone cares about a social responsibility is also something that struck me. And finally, I think the most important is that a cleaning staff can actually give you a notice. Mind you, Tsinghua is an elite university. It's not a provincial level university. It's the most premier of the university, and we are living in the foreign students hostel. So it's a very elite space, and the fact that to such an elite person, a cleaning staff could give a notice, it's just beyond imagination. I have gone to I mean, my all my education has been in India. I have been to all kinds of Indian universities, and this is not how Indian students talk to ear cleaning staff. Um, and so I think that talks about the third thing talks about a kind of uh, empowerment of the working class that happened within the Maoist China. Of course, we can talk about how there has been a significant disempowerment of the working class as a class since the reform and opening, precisely at a time when China achieved massive amount of economic success, but there has been a relative loss of the power of the working class in terms of its political ability. That's a different point. But if you compare India and China, uh, there is a massive difference in terms of how the working class feels about their own existence. So that was I think that was a moment that clarifies a lot of distinction between India and China. But if we are to go deeper into all the divergences, there is a lot to talk about that. But maybe I'll stop here and let you ask if you want to know something specific about my thoughts.
Yeah, yeah, and there was quite a bit in there. We will certainly touch on a bunch of the things that you mentioned. You started to talk about the legacy of the Maoist period with regard to literacy. Um, I did want to, maybe start with that. A lot of the differences between today's India and China, can be explained by looking at the nature of the liberation struggle. So how do you look back on that period? The leading up to the 40s and following a little bit after that. And I would add also, what were the class forces at play in explaining these differences between China and India and the nature of their liberation?
Yeah, that's a big question, and that involves several layers. I mean, without getting too much into history, let me start from about 1920s because that's where modern forms of politics emerged. The Indian National Congress began to become the leading organ of the Indian national liberation movement, and that's where both the KMT and the CCP tried to wrestle against the military landlord. So 1911, the long-standing Qing state broke down in China. And from there, we got a period of decentralized, fractured politics, controlled by multiple landlords, and there was no centralization. And from 1921 on, there was in fact, 1924-27 was the first pact between the KMT and the CCP. Both were nationalist parties. And the point to understand here is that they were very urban at this stage, and they tried to gain cities like Shanghai, cities like Guangzhou, Wuhan, where industrial labor had expanded its base. And it was by mobilizing the industrial workforce that they emerged as and most of these industries were in the hands of foreign capital. So that's where the national question and the class question came to the very forefront in the case of China. Of course, as we know, from 1927 onwards, there was the split, and it started with the massive massacre of the CCP cadres in the infamous rather Shanghai massacre of 1927, where numbers vary, but at least 5,000 to 10,000 CCP cadres were eliminated, and the KMT began to press down on the CCP. And from there on, the CCP actually retreated to rural China. And that's where the CCP actually transformed itself from an urban based party to a fundamentally rural based party. And that's where the beginning of the actual Chinese Revolution started. And of course, the KMT started to rebuild from 1927 to 1937, as we call it, as the Nanjing decade in China. There was this massive process of centralization in the core area under KMT, where because they had to reconstruct, they started increasing the tax base. It was part of that modernizing project, whether they had to provide infrastructure, whether they had to provide education to the literati and so on. They needed resources, and they started to squeeze. And Ralph Thaxton has worked on it, and he finds that it was at this moment when the CCP cadre in the rural resisted against the excessive taxation of the KMT. This was even before the Japanese invasion had started. And then, of course, after the Japanese offensive started from 1937 on, again, there was the second pact where the KMT and the CCP started to work together for the liberation. And then after Japan fell, then the CCP and the KMT again fought the main force of the class struggle, if you like, that often called as the Civil War. The CCP representing that class forces led from the peasantry, and KMT representing a urban base, which was increasingly, increasingly hegemonized by indigenous capital, national bourgeoisie, and so on and so forth, including foreign capital and foreign powers, which didn't want that revolution because, after all, it was a threat to private property, which was spreading at that point in time. So that was the story on the Chinese side. We can discuss what happened after, but it's important to come back to the Indian side, which I find is a contrast to that. It's Indian modern politics started picking up at the same time after the First World War. It was from the what was called as the non-cooperation movement, starting with the 1920s. The Gandhian movements began to emerge as the massive mobilization against British imperialism. And it was also at that time that Britain had itself considered some kind of self-governance, not full independence at this point in time, but they were ready to provide more powers at the provincial levels, delegating the most important powers, retaining the most important powers to the central state under British India. It was where millions and millions of peasants under Gandhi were mobilized, but mobilized particularly on the national question of liberation. And you can find some histories of anti-chowkidari campaign, anti-forest tax campaigns, and but more or less the Indian National Congress actually controlled rather than mobilized these class forces, whether in urban or in the rural. In the urban, we see in the case of Bombay, for instance, the massive strikes in Girangaon in late 1920s. That was all under the influence of the Communist Party in Bombay. In the rural, actually, the Congress Party became a much more controlling force because in 1937 it came to power at the provincial level, and it wanted to have its stable taxation base, and for that it had to rely on the rural property class, rural land owning class. These were mainly upper caste landowners, which provided stability in British India for a very long time. And the Congress made a tacit pact with them. And so the big contrast here is that the Indian mobilization was primarily by an intelligentsia class, which, of course, it used the peasantry. Of course, it mobilized against colonialism, but the very class question was subdued under it. And there were moments where it tried to erupt, but the Gandhian movement actually controlled him. And the most classic case was the Sauri Chaura, which there's a great book by Shahid Amin who writes about this, that precisely at the point of that moment of rupture when the peasants took law and order in their hands and killed 22 British 22 Indian policemen under the British India. Gandhi started to criticize them. And same was true when there were industrial strikes in the city of Ahmedabad and so on and so forth. So I think to sum up the pre-liberation phase, I see the Chinese phase, the history of modern national liberation movement, because there was a pre-modern national liberation movement, but the history of 28th century modern national liberation movement for the Chinese side was very fundamentally a class question, while in the Indian case, the class questions was there, but the national bourgeoisie kind of controlled that class question and primarily directed the movement for self-rule.
That's great. And you're right that that was like a lot to throw at you. Some of these other questions, and you did a great job. Some of these other questions might also be equally big. Feel free to just take it in whichever scope you feel like you can speak to. The other thing I'll point out for listeners is that we've also written a piece on the Journal of International Solidarity, sort of discussing these, the class distinctions in the liberation struggle, comparing between China and India. The piece is called "China and India: A Sisterhood That Could Have Been." I'll link it in the description. Okay. Another major distinction between the two countries, and one that particularly interests me, is the situation of women and the institution of patriarchy. I was just looking up. The maternal mortality rate in India is 6.1 times higher than that in China. 6.1 times higher. That's worth emphasizing. In terms of literacy, we touched on this. China has a female literacy rate of around 95%, while India is at just around 70. Also, one thing you hear over and over again from obviously, Chinese women, women that live in China, but also women that travel to China, is that it's extremely safe for women. The cities are walkable even at night. So, how do you see this issue? How do you think about it? And something that interests me as well is what do you think class has to do with the strength of patriarchy in India and really across the subcontinent as well?
Yeah, I think good way to start is to look at the data on property rights if you want to understand the gender question and the class question and how they are entangled. If you look at the data, AIDS calculates um, women's property ownership in India to be at 14%. Actually, uh, the figure is even smaller. Their own survey calculates the rural the ownership is about 11%, but we have the National Family Health Survey data, which specs it at 8%. Um, and it's only when you consider joint ownership, it rises higher to the mid 30s. But as we know that the joint ownership of property is nothing for women. It's just a piece of paper that's just useless. So what is essential to understand here, and it's essential to note that the low ownership rate of property in India is lower even by global standard. So if we're talking about joint ownership, it's in the mid 30s for India, but in Vietnam, for instance, it's about 64 to 65%. In African countries, Rwanda, for instance, it's about 80%. And then in the OECD countries, it's mostly, everything is mostly joint because it's urban. The rural sector is much smaller. So if you are a family, mostly women and men have 100% joint ownership in their property and housing. So the first point to begin is that housing ownership is at about 10%, land ownership is at about 8% for women in India. Um, so that's the first point. The second point is to look at the labor force participation. Now, of course, ignore all the recent spike in the women's participation in the labor force that we are getting in India, because that is precisely by including lots and lots of agriculture laborers as self-employed, that it has sharply risen from the mid 20s, like 24-25%, as to upwards of late 30s, even 40% participation within a year, year, which can never happen. By Indians, women's labor force participation was falling for the last decade. So if you take out the sleight of hand, it is a very small women's participations in the labor force. So you don't have property and you don't have a job. I think you can add the third element to it, which is the high total fertility rate in India, high population, which means you have more children. So you don't have property, you don't have job, and you have more children to attend. So basically, what we are seeing combine all of that together is that massive amount of social reproductive labor, whether it's direct reproductive labor, whether it's the family labor in agriculture, in child rearing, in cooking, cleaning, etc., etc. That's how women's labor has been completely exploited, and women are completely kept out of the decision making. And finally, I think it brings us to that question of um, safety and overall levels of sexism in India, which is incredibly high. I mean, women are not safe in India. I mean, women are not safe in other places as well, but India is incredibly an exception. I mean, and that starts right from the family. If you look at the National Crime Record Bureau, you see that this bulk of the more than 90% of crime against women comes from people who you know, your relatives and teachers, people at workplace, and so on and so forth. So we are an extremely sexist society. Sexual violence is incredibly high. Our streets are almost sanitized of women. I don't want to say 0% because that would take away all the agency, but you can see the difference. The Chinese cities, as you say, I mean, if you go out in any of the Chinese, as life starts like at about 8 p.m. in the evening, you would see a lot of women and children. You go at a comparative Indian city, I mean, there can be some exceptions, but you would never see so many women and children. Um, so I think that that basically tells us, and then finally I think the Indian state's weakness on the developmental state. So whether it's availability of contraception, whether it's availability of institutional delivery, whether it's overall levels of nutrition, because the Indian state is a laggard state and Chinese state has done much better, so you get all kinds of better indicator. But that's cross population, that's not just on the women question. Cross population, you see more literacy, you see better mortality rates, life expectancy, etc., etc. You pick up any social indicators, it is higher. So that is, of course, also reflected on the gender question. I am not. I don't follow the gender dimension on China very closely. My work is mostly on the economic realm, so I would not comment on that. But when I talk to my feminist friends from China, they say there is a lot to go even there as well. So yeah, that's where I would end.
Thanks for that. Um, And another major commonality between the two countries, especially following liberation, is that um, most of the population, as we've been talking about, belong to a rural or agricultural background. And you can still, say that today this is still very much the case in India, especially. I would also posit that a big part of the women's liberation anti-patriarchy question also hinges on the agrarian question very much. So what's your take on how, these two countries dealt with the so-called agrarian question, both in the past and today?
Yeah, I mean, uh, there is a bit of prehistory which we can't go into detail, but to place that in the context, if you look at the Chinese studies on agriculture, starting from Dwight Perkins, who does this massive amount of agricultural studies, you know, um, um, Thomas Roski and others, there is a there is a mild upward trend in Chinese productivity and Chinese rural income and in overall Chinese progress, roughly from the 17th century onwards. Of course, interrupted from time to time from all the exodus, all the external crisis, whether it's all kinds of, from Boxer Rebellion to, all kinds of breakdown of the Qing state to famines and floods to all the imperial wars and so on and so forth. Those were interruptions. But even Thomas Roski finds that even with all these interruptions, the book called as The Growth in Pre-War China, he finds a good bit of growth, 1% real growth in China, 1% annual real aggregate growth in China from the late 1890s to 1937, where he stops because that's where the Second World War starts. And that was despite all the shocks, all the external shocks in China, fall of the Qing state and so on and so forth. If you look at the Indian story, comparable Indian story, I mean, there was a boom phase between 1820s but that ended at the end of the American Civil War. That was primarily driven by high commodity price, primarily that of cotton, because there was the cotton textile industrial revolution that was happening in the West, and so there was a kind of greater income for those who had shifted to some of these cash crops, but the overall story declines. So even the commodity boom story comes at the expense of the food story. But overall, there is a sharp downturn in Indian agriculture from 1890s onwards. And Indian agriculture was completely stagnant. Population started to rise from 1921 primarily because of not any change in social structure, but because of modern technology. And that meant that massive pressure, amount of stress was generated on land. Productivity was not rising in proportion to, so it was kind of a Malthusian trap that was happening. So what I want to contextualize here is that even though we say that India and China were same at the point of liberation, they were close, but there were some differences even to begin with. So even life expectancy, India was at 37 years, China was at 41 years. There was a qualitative difference there. But I think from there on came the first point of difference. China, as we said, came off the communist revolution, which was primarily an agrarian revolution. In India, the national bourgeoisie came to power. And what happened in India was a real tragedy. There were land reforms, which basically had three components, I would say. First was the abolition of the zamindari. So it was the rent collecting rights of the landowners were legally slashed. But what happened was that they were now converted from absentee rent collecting landowner to someone who owns the land and employ hired labor. So as long as we were ready to employ hired labor there, the state was okay. In fact, the state accepted that because the state was going for the capitalist means of accumulation. So most of the tenants were evicted by using massive force of the landowners, and they were able to amass a lot of land, which they already retained a formal ownership through the zamindari right, which was their rent collecting. Now they became the property owner, and the Indian state accepted that contract as long as you're ready to employ hired labor by using tax subsidy. So all the tax subsidies, whether credits, whether water, fertilizers, they were funneled into these pockets of rich peasantry. There is a regional dimension as well, which we can discuss if you're interested. So that's the first part of it. In the second part, the tenancy movement was defeated. So tenancy was where the landless laborers were occupying the lands. They were cultivating them, but they never got the ownership. They were fighting for ownership, but that was defeated. That was defeated again by using massive amount of force of the landlords, and also a lot of rich farmers declaring themselves as kutkast, which is the land owning peasantry. So that was the second combination, and the third component was the ceilings were already very high, and then a lot of that was bypassed by partitioning them within the family. So you declare your land in 5 different names within your family to bring it. And finally, the small amount that was redistributed, they were the worst kind of land, ecologically stressed, unfertile, and in exchange of massive amount of compensation from the Indian exchequer. A Reserve Central Bank of India's calculation says that 670 crores were spent from the Indian exchequer in the early 1970s. It's a massive, incredible number. What happened in China? Uh, Complete elimination of landlordism by force. Private property was eradicated, and it's a huge story. I don't want to get into all of that, whether all the use of violence and coercion was necessary or not. I mean, there is a rich literature on that, but the bottom line is that they eliminated land ownership. Now, of course, the Chinese story is different. Um, there you find a positive cycle because of the redistribution of land, starting with a lower Gini coefficient, coupled with universal literacy, rural healthcare, and so on and so forth. There is an upswing of that in the early 1950s. The communes were smaller, they were organic, they had retained their village character, and the massive industrial concentration had not even begun. But this story begins to change by 1957 when we need to understand that China had lost most of its industrial base either to war or to Taiwan or Hong Kong. And even in the northeastern Manchuria, there was a lot of asset stripping that happened when the Russians were there. So there was a need to rapidly industrialize. But then that ran into the problem of surplus extraction. And so from 1957 onwards, the Great Leap Forward of 1958 runs into a great disaster, catastrophe and contention against from Ralph Texans. Texton is a good work on that. How the CCP, which had resisted the KMT in the 1930s and the 1940s to gain the legitimacy among the peasantry, now they are extracting more from the peasants. And then again, the other component of the Great Leap Forward is a massive diversion of peasant labor to, non-peasant labor, basically iron smelting and dam project and construction and so on. So precipitated one of the biggest famines in modern history. Millions were killed. And that so that was the Chinese story, but on the Indian side, you get a rise of landlessness, complete elimination of large sections of Indian peasantry from not just property but all kinds of subsidies. So they became the landless laborers. Um, and indebtedness, because you don't get credit. Money lending was extremely high. The British has constituted this bastardized capitalism in India, which meant that a huge amount of parasitic class existed in the rural only through lending, all of which were not the Chinese case. So that's how you can understand this story up until the reforms and opening had started in China. I think the story from the 90s is different. Of course, the progress that China has made since the reform and opening, but particularly after the 90s, was not necessarily by revitalizing or not necessarily by finding an ultimate solution to the agrarian question, but by massively transferring population out of the rural into the industry. So its population shrunk, rural population shrunk to about 17%. In India, it's still up to, late 40s, 50%. It's still in the rural. China, of course, has larger ecological stress, but that difference is now converging with Indian ecological stress being increasing, and China is doing much more. Also, the stress is less in China now that a lot of population lives in urban. That also has so. Of course, the rural has fallen behind in China. In terms of education, Roselle has worked on that. You don't get good education, so even a lot of migrant gives up now on their rural social security because they want to they want their kids to get better education, which are all located in the urban. So so there is a falling behind. Much less amount of capital goes through old care pension, health insurance, and so on. All in those terms, the rural has fallen behind even in China. So that is a big concern even in China. And the Chinese inequality is most fundamentally a spatial inequality. So it's up there from Xinjiang through Guangzhou, and you can come through Yunnan, and eventually Guizhou, and Guangxi. The western part, which is not the coastal part, is the laggard region. So per capita there is a difference of 2 to 3 times. Um, and the Indian story is that from the 90s onwards, there has been a lot of substitutions of the rural goods by synthetics, and population has been increasing. And there was a period between 2002 and 2012 where rural population shrunk for the first time. Percentage of rural population was already shrinking always, but the absolute number had shrunk. That was because of massive amount of non-farm jobs that were created during the high growth years in India. But lately we are seeing that rural population are again going up. Now the agriculture ministry says that that is because of revolutionary technology in agriculture, that people are being drawn back into agriculture, which is so much of bullshit, if you like. It talks about a tremendous urban distress which has caused to reverse migration triggered by the pandemic, but people feeling unsecured have never been back. And so yes, the rural story is the real lagger story, not just in India, but also unfortunately in China. Although the scale is very different, the nature is very different. You can even include um, the West there. In the US, we are getting very concrete data that the rural has fallen behind, and that's the most firm supporter of the Trump and the right wing. In France, we see that its peasantry has fallen behind, and so on and so forth. So I think that there is this global movement where the rural has lost out.
Okay, we started to talk about the 90s onward. Maybe we started on it a little bit, so maybe let's be brief on this. I'm gonna try to combine two things together, but essentially the neoliberal period from the 90s onwards saw, major shifts in both of the countries in different ways. Um, and in a lot of ways that also sort of marks a major divergence in the trajectory between India and China. Briefly, how do you reflect on that period into the present? And also, I guess the second part of this is how do you see neoliberalism as impacting the class structure in India? And here I'm thinking of specifically strengthening the Indian bourgeoisie, and maybe a third sub question is where does Hindutva fit into that? So yeah, a lot on the table for you there. Take it however you'd like. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I must say the part of the reason why the answers are long are because I'm trying to cover two stories together. So even if these are like one questions, I'm effectively answering two questions in parallel. But very briefly, if I were to say the 90s and the early 2000s for China, first of all, it's essential to recognize that it was not neoliberalism for them. For China, it was introducing market elements into an economy which didn't have market elements, and so that's why it is called as the reform and opening. And opening means how to not just industrialize for export, but also receive massive amount of FDI from the 90s onwards. Chinese FDI from the 90s clocking tunes of 60 to 70 billion dollar every year, and it keeps on increasing. Eventually, China joins the WTO in 2001. Tariff barrier comes down. There were enterprise reforms. It's I mean, you can bring out some complexities. For instance, a lot of the public sectors. There was this famous dialogue slogan of Zhu Rongji, who was the head of the reforms. He said that. Hold on to the big and let the small go. That was in regards to the state-owned enterprises, which means that from 95 to 2002, there were layoffs of several millions to the tune of 40 to 60 million state-owned employees, excuse me. A lot of them, although got absorbed into the private sector. So there has been an informalization, but the informalization is different in scale because it was 100% formalized sector being informalized into 40%. So you still have 60% formalized job there. Chinese miracle comes primarily from being able to export to begin with the low value goods, but increasingly more and more middle, and now we are seeing very high value goods. So this is for the first time in human history where an exporting nation has monopolized all the four layers of the value chain. So they are almost have a monopoly of from starting with the very low research good like leather goods to low tech textiles to electronics and machineries to now even the high techs, the space technology, the military technology, and you name it. The Indian story is very different. In fact, in many ways, it's exactly the opposite. Indian current account deficit increased after reform and opening. Of course, growth picked up, but with more growth, you see a widening of current account deficit because there is a larger demand internally, which is met from met from import from outside. So there is an interesting graph that comes out of my research where the high growth years in China the graph parallels the increase in the current account surplus, while the high growth years in India corresponds to the increase in the current account deficit. Now, of course, India doesn't see a balance of payment crisis because India has been able to also get some FDIs, not to the scale of the Chinese, but reasonable amount of FDIs, but also short-term capital inflow. And that's where India's story is one of the success stories compared to, let's say, a lot of African countries, our neighbors, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, which are facing balance of payment because A, their current account deficit increases, but B, also they are able to attract any kinds of capital inflow. But nevertheless, there are downsides. I think, politically speaking, because of the not dismantling, but the weakening of the state sector, labor movement has become extremely weak now. In India, so trade union membership and so a lot of people who would have otherwise entered the Indian state sector has found jobs in the high-end service sector that has come up because of liberalization. So in India, you don't see a massive change in the formal sector and the informal sector. It's not that the Indian economy was highly formalized even within the near. It was a highly informal, and a very small bourgeois section was within the formal sector. Jonathan Parry has done great work on that. It says that the Indian formal sector is effectively a privileged sections which has always been with the ruling class than being part of the working class, and the rest of them is informal. So a decline of the BSNL would create jobs in air. Now, how much precarious and all that is a question, but roughly speaking, you see a decline of the state sector, some kind of decline of the state sector coupled with the rise of the private sector, which has absorbed that, and the rest of them has remained informal. Wages have remained stagnant, and the class question has completely fizzled out. And I think that kind of relates to your final question about the rise of Hindutva, which is as of also I think one of the points to remember here is that the growth that neoliberalism had brought in was very much tied to the external conditions. So the global financial crisis precipitates, and that growth story eventually collapses. A lot of liberalization of credit. A lot of growth is actually also because of liberalization of credit in the Indian sector, whether it's in the real estate, whether it's in the automobiles, and now increasingly we are seeing more and more consumer credits being bubbling up, like the U.S. economy. You go to Amazon, you can eventually buy an Apple phone by paying a very nominal amount of EMI. So the global financial crisis precipitated a crisis in India, and that got the banks non-performing assets rose, a lot of projects were halted down, the overall growth slowed down, and the Indian National Congress, which was the ruling party, faced a huge loss of legitimacy. And a lot of also, it's important to remember the Indian neoliberal story. The Indian National Congress had a neoliberal wing, but also had a progressive wing. So, the likes of Manmohan Singh, the likes of Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and all they were more towards the technocratic neoliberal side, which were looking at the reform side, which were looking at the external side. But there was the National Advisory Council, where people like Harsh Mander, Jyoti Ghosh, John Drays, and others, which were looking at the question of nutrition. So you get the National Food Security Act. There's question they were looking at education. So you are get or employment. You get the MG which is the employment guarantee. So the corporate taxes actually kept on increasing, and income tax kept on increasing, due to which I find there was a massive revolt against the Indian National Congress. So if you look at the net income tax and corporate tax, it rises from 2003 up until 2012. And so there was a revolt. I saw that the business class had shifted almost entirely uh, to the BJP, because they became much more direct champions of their interests. And so from media, which was always with the liberalization controlled by the business class, it came under the power of the BJP. And finally, the massive amount of entry of money into electoral politics has meant that whoever has the hand of the biggest business class would win the elections. And then you need an ideological plank, because politics needs mobilization. When you mobilize to a communist party, the class question becomes your identity. Questions of development become your identity. But when there is a neoliberal business politics, that cannot mobilize the democratic electoral process. So you need cultural factors, you need nationalism, militarism, all kinds of that. And that's where religion comes into power. We are seeing a lot of that in West Africa and so on, rise of use of counter-revolutionary forms of religion with neoliberalism. So I think that's effectively my answer.
That's great. That's amazing. Okay, maybe we'll leave it with this last question. China seems to see its future together with the rest of the global South. Partly or in big part because of circumstance in a lot of ways. And the rest of the global South is also seeing almost an unprecedented opportunity to pursue development with the help of China. On the other hand, you also have India trying to position itself as a leader of sorts in the global south. But also there's quite a bit of hostility between China and India, mostly from the Indian side toward China, I would say. Um, so how do you see the future of these connections between China and India on the one hand, and both of their relationships to the global south?
Yeah, that's a question where it's a question about the future, and things are so unpredictable that your guess and my guess or anyone's guess are like almost have equal likelihood, because there is just no certainty. So it's hard to say, and there are different elements to it. The relationship, the future of India-China relationship is not merely in the hands of in India, China, but also has a lot to do with where the West and China relationship goes. Because if there is a greater rise of tension between the West and China, then all sorts of attempts and concessions would be given to India to jump on board with that reactionary imperialist West against China, because they need a rebalancing force. And so you see all kinds of bubbling up of military alliances like AUKUS and so on and so forth. So that's the global context, which is hard to predict. But on the national question, I think the biggest obstacle has been the border question, which is again a kind of tragedy, given India, as Victor Gao from China recently said, that India is a great nation, but India has to remember that there were empires before the nation states emerged, both in China and in India. And so the kind of borders that one side assumes to be settled borders are never settled, because these are empires, and some empires are bigger than others. We know that the British Empire was much bigger than the Chinese Qing Empire. Qing Empire was at the receiving end, where the British Empire was rising. And so a lot of the borders that the British Empire, considered settled, are of course not considered settled by the Chinese side, but they are open to negotiations. I think in India there has been this memory of the 1962's humiliation. There is a long history of that. I don't get into that, but one has to come out of that mindset and consider the border problems as a border problems which needs to be resolved. The good side between India and China, as you said, the hostility is not on the Chinese side. Unlike in the case of India and Pakistan, where there are deep histories of antagonism, there is a lot more to be healed, there is a lot more to be worked out. You don't see the centerpiece of Chinese nationalism as India. In fact, no one knows about India. The few people who asks you about India in China would be taxi drivers who's interested in Buddhism, or people who are actually went into political science or international relations department and know something about China. Other than that, it's not even in their picture. So the good thing is India is not part of a Chinese nationalism, but China definitely is wary of India being sucked into the Western imperialist, because that's what historically the story been. We are seeing some good developments recently, some kind of announcements, also the detail, although the details are not official, but some kind of announcements on both sides that there is a disengagement process from the border standoff that we saw in 2020. China is also saying that they want to buy more products from India, given India have something to offer. And India also decided to open direct flights with China, which were not there. But there's still a lot to be done. There are still sanctions on Chinese investments in India. Until recently, there was a sharp reduction in visa granted and so on. Those are the nitty gritties and the small. I think the big question I see about the future would be, uh, in what ways India can learn from China. And China is increasingly becoming a massive capital exporter. We always hear about the FDI that went into China, but today China is the third largest FDI exporter after the United States and Japan. So, there is a lot of space for cooperation in capacity development, in infrastructure. India lacks massively infrastructure. China wants to invest in infrastructure. China has a massive history of building human capital. India is desperately in need to raise its human capital very rapidly. And for all that to happen, I think all we need is the old fashioned neutrality, the spirit of the non-aligned movement. And I think India is a large country. It doesn't have to jump on board on either of these sides. So I think that's where India, and finally, where does Indian nationalism goes? Because as you know, Indian nationalism historically never had the Chinese component so strongly attached to it. The BJP came to power and made this very central to Indian nationalism, partly because the Muslims are so disempowered effectively in India, and there is a massive divergence now happening between India and Pakistan, that the Pakistan question kinds of fails to galvanize Indian nationalism unless you are among the sort of rabid nationalists. If you're kind of liberal middle class and you have to be integrated into a kind of aggressive nationalist project that revitalizes you, it has to be China, because there is some sort of catching up and stuff like that. So I think if Indian nationalism is directed in a positive way, if Indian politics, you know, is able to maintain that neutrality, I think there is a bright spot for India-China relationship. I think the story is entirely positive from the Chinese side, given the West is not going to pull back its punches on China. China would be increasingly looking for greater cooperation within the global south, and India, being a large country, has a lot to offer. Chinese has been sending signals after signals. It is up to us whether we catch those signals.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a good place to end this on. I gave you a whole bunch of a wide range of questions, covered a lot of ground, and I think you did a great job at that. So, thank you again for joining us. Before you go, can you let the audience know where they can find your work and your excellent channel?
Yes, thank you. And I we have a bunch of social media handles by India and Global Left. I don't remember the exact details, but you can find them. But I think our big platform is the YouTube channel India and Global Left. So if you're watching this, go check out the channel. And yes, that's pretty much what I wanted to plug in.
That's great. Thanks again so much, Jyotishman.
Thanks a lot, Ashwin, and keep doing what you are doing. It's a great start, and happy to be a part of your platform.
Thank you. Thanks again. That was our conversation with Jyotishman from India and Global Left. Please check out their program on YouTube. You can find it linked in the description. And once again, you can follow us on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. Otherwise, reach out to us to let us know your thoughts and feedback. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.